Final Fantasy VII Remake was first announced all the way back in 2015, to say people were overjoyed is an understatement. It was such a powerfully unifying moment for the Final Fantasy community. For many, to know what they had been hoping for since the 2005 technical demonstration for the PlayStation 3 was finally coming to fruition was an incredible feeling. After numerous spin-offs, a movie, and any other Final Fantasy VII related things Square could throw at us, they were finally going to give us what we really wanted. Final Fantasy VII completely rebuilt from the ground up, as though it were a modern title. It was a very euphoric feeling at the time, but December of that same year, we would get a pretty unexpected surprise. Final Fantasy VII Remake wasn't just one game, it would actually be multiple games, or episodic as it's been described. This became a huge point of contention for many people, and make no doubt, still very much is for a lot of people, but I've actually come to realize it's one of the best decisions that Square Enix could have possibly made for the game, and yes, it's even made me grow more confident in the remake's success. But when it was first announced though, it was incredibly shocking and almost devastating for me to hear at first. Just the first few seconds of reading the headline almost made me get outraged, assuming that it was going to be somewhat similar to the structure of the Telltale games, where each game is divided into something like a 2-hour episode. With a game like Final Fantasy VII, I don't want to be stuck waiting for bite-sized chunks to be fully re-immersed. And it was made worse at the time because Square Enix didn't clarify how many parts there would be. So without any set expectations, fans were left to wonder. And when fans are left to wonder, they either hype things to infinity or they burn things to the ground. Part of the reason for this panic was simply due to the fact that we didn't know how many of these volumes the game would be divided into. And at the moment of me recording and writing this video, we still don't. When producer Yoshinori Kitase was asked on the matter, he said, quote, "We do have an idea on the project side in terms of how many installments it will consist of, but unfortunately we can't share that at the moment. Of course, as we're creating and developing the scenario and the stories, these are things that move in real time, so the plan may change along the way. But that said, we do have a vision for how many installments it will consist of." He then later on clarified that these episodes weren't bite-sized chunks either, but full-sized games, and compared their playtime and their releasing structure to the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, which is composed of 3 full-sized games, with each of the games being released around 18 months apart from each other. We are now weeks away from E3, and we'll be finding out soon, while my gut strongly tells me that this remake will be divided into 3 parts, due to not only comparison to the Lightning Saga, but also the word multi-part just seems to indicate that there's at least 3 parts, and that it seems the most practical and profitable. However, there are now several rumors emerging that the game will be split into just 2 chapters, which if true would be incredibly good news. But there is one thing that remains clear to me. The multi-game structure is the only way Square Enix could have properly remade Final Fantasy VII. Yes, I'm serious, since Square hasn't been able to come up with a good word for it, as episodic admittedly even from them doesn't communicate how big these games are. I've personally started calling it a multi-game epic, which by the way Square Enix, feel free to let your marketing department use that one. It is to the benefit of all parties involved. Though if you don't believe me that this game couldn't be made without the multi-game structure, look no further than Final Fantasy XV. It was a game that was first introduced, or rather reintroduced, with the tagline "A World of the Versus Epic" under former director Tetsuya Nomura. It was originally slated to be the first Final Fantasy game to do this. Though it was announced and discussed a few times, it was quickly forgotten. But Final Fantasy XV was supposed to have multiple sequels, all part of a single collective story. Nomura saying on the matter, quote, "In the trailer there was a line that read, 'A World of the Versus Epic,' which suggests that it will be part of an epic. While Final Fantasy XV will have one climax as a story, we plan to continue it further. As for how long you'll be released, we'll announce that later on. However, having you wait for a long while for a next title isn't something we would desire. Circumstances would then change, and a new director, Hajime Tabata, would then come along. Then, for various internal reasons, Square would then cancel the plans for the multi-game structure. In its place, we would receive a myriad of DLC content, as a way to keep the story ongoing. The story was meant to be multiple games, and then it all had to be compressed into one title, which might be why you felt a certain rush in the second half of the game. That was the feeling of the budget and time running out. Altissia was meant to be the capital of an entire explorable nation, Accordo, and yet it had to be entirely cut, as As for the reasons why they couldn't just add Accordo and Niflheim as open world sections, Tabata estimates it would have had the development cost of another full game to do so. Do you see where I'm going here? Another full game. That's exactly the thing, and we want to avoid these cuts going forward. After all, Final Fantasy XV has one explorable continent, and a grand total of just 2 fully fleshed out towns, those being Lestallum and Altissia. Final Fantasy VII has 3 continents, plus surrounding islands, and you visit more towns in the first 10 hours of gameplay than Final Fantasy XV has in its entire continuity. Then there's developing Final Fantasy VII Remake in a way that won't make you go bankrupt. It's easy to look at games like Resident Evil 2 Remake and ask why Square Enix couldn't make it all in one part. The original Resident Evil 2's scope is still within the range of what can reasonably be done in the modern era of console games. Final Fantasy VII, however, is much more massive in scope than you can imagine. People think when you say that it means the game has like 200 hours of gameplay and like 16 endings. That's not what I mean by that. I mean the actual density of content. People usually think of Final Fantasy VII's scope in the wrong way. Not your standard of estimated playtime, but how often you are thrown into a wide variety of high-quality content and the extraordinarily high number of assets required to make that content. Let me explain. It's not so much that Final Fantasy VII is some uber-long game that Fallout and Persona 5 look like blips on the map. Nor is it a game that takes a lifetime to beat, but Final Fantasy VII, alongside Squaresoft's other Golden Era games, are easily some of the most content-dense games ever, and the number of high-quality assets it'll take to fill that game is completely insane, and it pretty much eclipses every other modern game. And I know The Witcher 3 is the first game many of you will compare to it, so let's compare it. Let's take enemies for example. The base game of The Witcher 3 seems to have approximately 90 total enemies in the game. Hey, speaking of enemies, how many bosses do you think an average video game has? 10, 15, maybe 20? Final Fantasy VII, as listed by the Final Fantasy Wikia, has 67 boss battles. 67 boss battles. Final Fantasy VII almost has as many boss battles as The Witcher 3 has regular enemies. But don't mistake me, I'm not saying that the remake will be better than The Witcher 3. In fact, chances are it probably won't be. But that was the scope of the original Final Fantasy VII, and to bring that into modern graphics is an insane task, and there is no way you can put that into one modern game. While back in the day these enemies were controlled by simple scripts that utilized flat textures, they now have to use AI, realistic sound effects, and not to mention their movesets that interact with the characters, and a ton of other things. There are 9 playable characters, which all now have their own unique playstyles, 16 summons, and there are 15 towns. How many modern games have you played with 15 fully fleshed out towns? In Final Fantasy XV, there was 1 playable character, although there's 4 now with the update. 5 if you count Arden and his DLC. 4 summons at launch, 1 additional summon added after, and there's just 2 towns. All these examples don't fully encapsulate the real magnitude of what Squaresoft managed to accomplish. They serve to demonstrate the simple fact: Final Fantasy VII's content density is absolutely mind-blowing. But even aside from that, Final Fantasy VII Remake is not going to be the exact same game again. It's also meant to be the ultimate Final Fantasy VII experience, and to accomplish this they have to add a lot of extra content. And they talked about this with such things as a fully explorable Midgar, which Midgar alone could house an entire game's worth of content on its own right. Characters like Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse are going to be getting full backstories in a way in which we've never seen before. If you're thinking about Final Fantasy VII Remake in terms of the content of Final Fantasy VII, then yes, the multi-game structure will seem like a disappointment, but it aims to be much more expansive and nuanced in a way in which we've never seen. If you are truly a fan of Final Fantasy VII, isn't that what you want to happen? A Final Fantasy VII that is so detailed in every way. You get to enjoy it on a level you never have before. And also, and I hate saying this, but if part 1 sucks, there's always a good chance that Square can make part 2 good, right? And also address a lot of feedback, or even patch those changes into the first game. After all, half of a bad remake is still better than a whole bad remake, right? Though, let's hope the remake is good from day one. But what I'm ultimately trying to say here is, the multi-game structure should be fully embraced. Final Fantasy VII Remake is going to flesh out the world of Gaia in a way it deserves. There of course will still be many detractors, and despite of the large amount of evidence, they of course fail to realize that you could just wait until all the parts are done and play them as a collection anyways, which by that time all the games in the collection will be heavily discounted. And you might argue that you shouldn't have to wait that long, long. But if they were all developed as one game, that's how long you'd be waiting anyways. In the end, I don't want Final Fantasy VII Remake to just be the 1997 classic again. I have that game and no game could ever be that game again. Instead, I want it to be the Final Fantasy VII that couldn't be made until now. So Ultima Weapons, are you excited for the multi-game structure? What are your biggest concerns or fears for it? Or do you plan to wait until the remake is fully delivered in a collection box? Subscribe, click the bell icon, and let your voice be heard in the comments below. And if you've been enjoying my content, be sure to check out the Patreon for the Night Sky Prince, like my awesome longtime supporter, Gliding Falcon. Thank you so much, Gliding Falcon. I greatly appreciate the support. Shout out to them and the rest of the Ultima community.